if there's a particular kind of expertise that's being ignored, usually in these kinds of disputes, it's not the expertise of the on-the-ground reporter. It's the expertise that is involved in philosophy that almost nobody ever bothers to exercise. Having medical knowledge doesn't give you economic, political, or philosophical knowledge. And these are things that all are unattended to.
Why do conspiracy theories seem to have such appeal? And why are people so quick to distrust experts and authorities on issues ranging from science to medicine to history? What's the right way to think about expertise in being rational about it when consuming information? Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Tristan de Liège, visiting fellow, and with me is Ben Baer, fellow. Hey, Ben. So today we're going to be looking at what we're calling the crisis in expertise. And this is an increased prominence of conspiracist thinking, a rejection of medical facts, a rejection of well-established historical perspectives, a general skepticism of scientific findings and historical findings, but in particular with so the Joe Rogan podcast, and we're going to talk about Douglas Murray's appearance on that podcast recently, is an interesting point of focus for this, is that there's a recent platforming of conspiracist thinking that I think we haven't seen until somewhat recently. Not only in media, so I just brought up podcasts, but also among politicians, so in the political sphere, and then obviously on social media. And these kinds of like podcast platforms and social media platforms obviously have a way of being able to disseminate that information at a scale and speed that just simply wasn't present before. And part of the impetus for this particular discussion is, like I said, that recent appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast by Douglas Murray. So Douglas Murray is the author of the book On Democracies and Death Cults. And that book is just about why so many people who are not familiar with, not experts on certain like historical and current events, such as the Israel-Gaza war, why do they so quickly take positions against Western culture, against democracies, and why are people so eager to challenge long-held historical assumptions about the nature of such conflicts, and also of historical facts such as how people think about World War II and rethinking about Churchill's role and Hitler's role. And part of Murray's goal in appearing on Joe Rogan's podcast was to challenge Joe Rogan, because he's had, in recent years, he's had appearances by not just people who question longstanding medical expertise or medical consensus on things like vaccines, but also on historical facts. So a prominent example of that is Daryl Cooper, who suggests that Churchill was a main antagonist of World War II and is largely responsible for generating the conflict that became World War II. And what Murray was trying to do there by appearing on there, in part, was to challenge the platforming of non-experts, promoting historical theories for which there's little evidence, or medical theories for which there's little evidence.
Yeah, so we should play some clips from the podcast itself. We've selected a few, both from the Rogan podcast and also from Douglas Murray's appearance on the Sam Harris podcast, where he discusses the first podcast. We've selected clips where some of the key points of philosophical contention come out. And so let's watch this first one, I think, which just sets up what the whole conflict is about.
There's some point at which I'm just raising questions is not a valid thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're not raising questions. You're not asking questions. You're telling people something.
Do you think Daryl's doing that?
I think there's a whole bunch of guys doing that.
I
I
think-
think Dave is doing that, very obviously. Dave's a comedian, but he's now mainly talking about Israel.
No,
I don't know if I'm mainly talking about Israel.
That's
but
all I see you
have
on the internet
opinions.
doing.
Yeah, but that's you.
Well, that
just,
might be what you've seen,
It's
but
just
I don't
you
think that's...
consuming-
But
clips.
that is also your shtick now, isn't it?
Well, what do you mean by that's my shtick?
Well, you're not a geopolitics guy in general, are you?
I don't even know exactly what you're asking.
I'm saying you've decided, being a comedian, you've decided now to become somebody who talks about Israel
This
and the
is not,
conflict.
I think you're incorrect. I don't think it's a decision.
So isn't Dave Smith just asking questions, Tristan?
So I think it's really important to clarify a few things, both about what Murray could be intending to express, and then what's right about that, and then the senses in which I think some of Dave Smith's reactions make sense. So I think part of what Murray is picking up on is there are far too many people who, and I think it's partly because of the podcast culture, partly because of social media and the abundance of access to opinions and more opinions than information or valid information, that far too many people think they can have a justified opinion on major world historical events. In this case, so they're talking about the Israel-Gaza war, without doing research, without consulting experts, without understanding the state of expert level knowledge at some level. There's a difference between you've seen some social media clips or you've listened to a podcast by someone who is not an expert on the Israel-Gaza war, and that's your level of knowledge of the conflict, or you've seen a few posts or you've read a few news articles and you don't know about the history of the conflict, for example. And I've noticed this over and over again in talking to friends or acquaintances or strangers, that there are people who they don't know the basic history of the conflict, like how the state of Israel was founded and why. What was the nature of the 1948 war, the 1967 war? Why did those wars start? Who was involved in those wars? What happened to all the peace processes in the later 20th century? And how did they break down? And how did it lead to this current situation? What's the nature of Hamas? What are Hamas's actual views and so on? And it's absolutely true that someone can't just pivot to start talking about that. And I think that's the sense in which what Douglas Murray is pointing out is an actual problem.
Yeah, I think as we move forward in our conversation today, we're going to, I think, get clear on what the nature of the problem is that we're commenting on. Part of the problem is that I think Murray himself is not very clear about articulating the nature of the problem. And so it's very easy to lampoon some of the things he's saying in certain moments. We'll get to some of those moments later. But just so, for example, one way the conversation often occurs in this podcast is Murray says, you can't say X given what you know. And the other side will say, what do you mean we can't say X? Implying, in effect, do you want to censor us? Do you think we should be censored? We shouldn't have the right to speak? And so this is a common equivocation that's used by this side of the argument, that's used to rationalize, try to justify people who make unjustified claims, where no, and Murray will often clarify in follow-up, no, I'm not, the point isn't that you don't have the right to say these things. People have the right to say all kinds of half-cocked, irrational stuff. The point is, what is it rational to say? That you can. The question is about what is it rational to say? What's a rational way to use your platform? Do you have the necessary qualifications to be taken seriously? So it's a question about if you have a platform, what's the right way to use it? Not should you have the right to use it, but what's the proper rational way to use it? Who should you let on your platform to say things? given that you have the right, what's the actually right choice to make? And then depending upon what kind of choices platform providers make, who should you actually listen to? You have the right to listen to all kinds of people, but who does it make sense to trust? Who should you trust? Who's it rational to trust? And Tristan, I opened the conversation by asking, isn't Dave Smith just raising questions? And this is one of the other retreats they will often use to justify what they're doing. It's one of their ways of saying, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just raising questions that I don't think anybody's answering. And one thing that I think Murray does say well in the clip that we just listened to is to say that that is a rationalization in effect, because the way that you are raising questions is actually asserting something. So like if the question you're asking is, could it be that maybe historians have been lying to us all this time about what Hitler did, for instance, then the fact that you need a maybe to ask a question means that you need to make a positive assertion to ask that question. And maybe is a positive assertion. People don't think that it is. People think it's a way of being neutral about something. But when you say something's maybe true, you're saying it's positively worthy of investigation. And that is something that itself requires evidence. So I think Murray's right that people who pretend not to be making claims are actually making claims. And part of the problem with it is a lack of attention to the necessary evidence, even for those claims about what may be true. So why do we need to listen to any experts at all? What's the positive case you can make for this? This was something that came up, I think, a little bit more clearly in that follow-up podcast that Sam Harris did with Douglas Murray. So let's watch a clip from that.
The first point I think we need to make is that everyone acknowledges, whether they want to or not, everyone acknowledges the reality of expertise and its importance. And this is a point I think you've made before, and I've made it as well in response to the aftermath of your podcast with Joe. Everyone, when they get on an airplane, wants their pilot to be a real pilot, not just, one who's LARPing as a pilot or who's self-taught, in a simulator they have at home. Unless they don't want to land the plane, right? In which case, unless they're jihadists, but let's leave that aside.
If you go in for brain surgery and just before you're wheeled into the operating theatre, comic Dave Smith appears and says, "I'm doing the task."
Yeah. I'm not an expert, but
I never claimed to be an expert, but I am carrying out the operation.
Yes. Okay. So there is just simply indisputable that there's in any domain that matters, and certainly in any domain that purports to be in touch with reality, any side of it, whether it's journalism, history, science, or just how to get things done, just physically, whether you're a plumber or not a plumber, right? The difference between knowing something or knowing nearly everything and knowing nothing is extraordinary, and it matters insofar as the topic matters.
So what are your thoughts, Tristan, on Harris's case for why we should trust experts?
Well, yeah. So I think the first thing I want to say is I'm really glad that Murray appeared on Harris's podcast, because I think this kind of clarification is exactly what was needed on the Joe Rogan podcast, discussion, but that Murray failed to make this point very clearly, is that if we just step back, it's really obvious that expertise is a real thing, that we need expertise, that a knowledge economy requires expertise. So, Sam Harris, he elaborates on this. That's not in the clip that we showed, but he elaborates on, you need it not just in the realm of knowing facts or theoretical facts, but in the realm of skills. Like someone, he brings up the surgery point, and that's both, right? So it's like, things about the human body, but then you also know practically how to conduct a surgery. Like someone understands plumbing, they understand electricity. And I think all of that points to, there's a division of labor in knowledge. So it's really important that some people know certain fields really, really well and that other people don't, because of the amount of time and investment required to know certain fields. It's really important to the development of knowledge. that we have this. And the division of labor point, I think, is what really has to be stressed, because what's really important for having expertise in a society is that everyone understands and cognitively respects or honors where they are in that intellectual division of labor. So there's a difference between, as Sam Harris puts it, if we pretend like there's no such thing as expertise, or if we pretend like you can do some research on Wikipedia on your own and then suddenly become an expert historian, you don't respect the fact that other people have more training, context, abilities, qualifications than you. And it undermines the whole way that division of labor works.
Yeah, and I think it's important that the reason to respect what you're calling, I think rightly, the cognitive division of labor is not a point to make because there's some elitist hierarchy and some people deserve to be admired and worshipped because they've got the gold stars or whatever. That's not the point. It's a division of labor that you should respect for the same reason that you respect, which means just acknowledge, division of labor and everything else in life. That you don't try doing all of your own subsistence farming. That would be in a modern economy, that would be pointless if you don't know how to do it. You farm it out to the farmers who are just better at doing it, and you're better at something else. And so and where this point derives from is not even fundamentally a point about division of labor, cognitive or otherwise. It's the fact that labor is needed at all to acquire knowledge. That knowledge is not something you're just born with. It's not something that you can figure out how to do on a lark. It's something that requires work to get knowledge. And this isn't even just a point about expertise. It's a point about any kind of specialized knowledge. And so then the question here, another part of the reason why it's not about some kind of elitism, is it's not a question of whether someone could do the work, because there's all kinds of jobs you could get if you wanted to do the study. The question is just, did you do the work to get the kind of knowledge that you need to have in order to pontificate on some kind of claim? And so the fact is that we can't know it all for ourselves. And this is not because some people are necessarily smarter or better than other people, though sometimes that's the case. It's simply because you have limits. Every person has limits. Every person has limits to the amount that they can know, because there's just so much to know. Like maybe there was a time in the vast, distant historical past where there were certain individuals who could know everything there was to know, but by now we've gotten well past that. And so if we want to be able to thrive in a civilized society, we need to be able to cash in on the knowledge that other people have. And cashing in here doesn't mean slavish reliance on them. It doesn't mean that whoever tells us anything we automatically believe. It doesn't mean taking it on faith, just on someone's say-so. Because in order to properly cash in on someone else's knowledge, you need to have some reason to think that they know what they're talking about. And so part of what we're talking about respecting the cognitive division of labor, is just doing the work on your own, the first-handed work, to figure out if the other person did the necessary work, if they did the work that it takes to know what they're talking about. And there's all kinds of simple kinds of questions and standards you can appeal to in order to judge that for yourself. If somebody's a doctor, do they have any kind of medical credentials? Do they work at a respected hospital? Do they have a track record of actually healing their patients? Can they explain in a simple way what their reason for the procedure they want you to undertake is, if we're talking about medicine? And what all of these are examples of is reducing your knowledge to first-handed observations you can make yourself. So you're not an expert in their field on your own, so you're never going to be able to evaluate all of their evidence for their claim, but you can evaluate evidence for whether they have some expertise, whether they know more than you on a certain subject. Tristan, we should probably also then listen to the next clip, and this is on a related subject, which is why should we listen to an alleged consensus of experts on certain subjects, which Murray is hanging a lot on, or rather, I think in this case, it's Harris who's hanging a lot on it. And part of what we're thinking about is this the right way to conceptualize some of the issues that we just talked about? So here's Sam Harris elaborating.
And so in that context, you can see that a consensus among experts is rather often meaningful, right? So if you have the lone person who's going against the consensus, if 99% of the specialists in a field believe X, and you've got somebody believing Y, maybe somebody who is himself an expert, he has the right credentials. But certainly in the case of someone who isn't an expert and doesn't have the right credentials, it is more often than not the case that you're not in the presence of a lone genius who's just figured everything out on his own. You're very likely in the presence of somebody who's mistaken or a crank or otherwise, has some incentive that is going undetected, and they're going against the mainstream for bad reasons. Now, that's not to say there's no such thing as there being a lone genius who does overturn a field of knowledge.
Sometimes it's Galileo.
Yeah. So, but if you had to walk into a casino and bet on prevailing opinion in any field, you would be right to bet on what 99% of oncologists think about this cancer, rather than your uncle who just has strong opinions about cancer, right? And that's to say, and that's just a probabilistic bet we all place every day whenever we're granting credence to knowledge claims, and we're always tending to go with the mainstream consensus of specialists, and that's because expertise really is a thing, and probability really is a thing.
Right. Well,
Right. So this is a very interesting point, because I think what Harris has said up until this point makes a lot of sense, but I think he sort of undersells his own case for the role of experts and the role of expert consensus. And I think the respect in which he undersells it is that it's not just a probabilistic bet. It's not as though, you're just faced with different odds and you're just saying, well, maybe all of these experts are just wrong, but I'm going to go with the likelihood that because there's a certain quantity or something like that, a certain quantity of information on their side or something like that they've published, or a quantity of institutions, that you go with the larger quantity or something like that, and that's like the probabilistic bet. It's true that we make decisions based on probability. Sometimes our time is very limited, but when we're thinking about like overall, when you're taking a field seriously, and like, why do you take a consensus of a field seriously, or a consensus of experts seriously? I don't think it's right to think about it as probabilistic. What's happening instead is you have an evaluation of evidence that field is a real field, that it deals with things actual in reality. You can see, for example, if we're talking about doctors, you can see that certain surgeries like are well understood, and like people have had them, and they've had successful operations from them. So that people have access to that kind of knowledge. That the qualification for becoming a doctor is very difficult, and there are lots of checks and balances, and all of that figures into it, and not just in a probabilistic way, but in the sense that you have access to that information, and it's not like you're just guessing or making a bet. I think in particular the problem is thinking about it as a bet, like it's just you're going off of chance, as if you were gambling. What I think Harris should have said is that you do need evidence that people are experts, and that a field is a real field, and that it's a legitimate field, and that the field is well enough established that it can make real claims. I think this is one reason why it's at least understandable. We don't need to get into it, but it's at least understandable that people would have more skepticism, for example, of a newer field like evolutionary psychology that hasn't had a lot of successful predicting power, is like a lot more recent, than something like evolutionary biology, which is much more well established, has been shown to have a lot of explanatory power, and has successful predictive power as well. So I think putting it in terms of probability is not the right way to think about it.
Yeah. So one thing I think we should clarify is what we mean when we say this is not just an issue of probability. I think the more precise way to put it is to say it's not about counting the number of people in a field that agree or disagree with the claim, or at least it's not simply that. And part of the reason I think it's important to clarify that is because a lot of the time when you rely on other people who know more than you don't accept what they say with certainty. You accept it with a high degree of probability. And I think that's very common. I think it's very common that it's usually just a high level of probability you invest in a person you trust. You don't assume that they're 100%, that you don't assume with 100% certainty that they're right. So the point is, it's not about counting heads. It's not about taking surveys, or it's not simply about taking kind of statistical surveys of what the self-appointed experts in a field claim. And it is important that it's not enough to be a self-appointed expert. If you simply listen to the people who tell you you're experts, there's a decent possibility that they might be wrong about whether they are. And so part of what you have to do here is not simply count heads, but you have to, and you were gesturing toward this, Tristan, when you talked about the difference between evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, that one of the things you assess is, what do they even claim to be experts of? Are they experts of a field that itself has some validity to it? So an even starker example is if 99% of the self-appointed experts in the field of astrology claim that you're going to have a good March, that is basically zero reason to trust them, because we don't have any good reason to think that astrology is actually a valid scientific field. We don't have any good reason to think in the first place that the position of the stars in the sky could somehow influence us on Earth, let alone our destiny, given the fact that we have free will. So there's just all kinds of reasons to discount that even as a valid field. And then within the wider range of what are taken to be more modern scientific fields, there's degrees and ranges of a successful track record. You mentioned biology, evolutionary biology versus evolutionary psychology. If you want to have something really stark, take the difference between experimental quantum physics, which is like one of the best tested theories in all of the physical sciences. Now, there's a separate question of how do you interpret it, but like knowing that things will adhere to the Schrodinger equation in various experimental setups is just so well tested that you can't really contest it. Likewise, with a lot of other aspects of developed the modern physical sciences, versus something like nutrition science, which has data and it has certain kind of methodologies, but the methodologies are not nearly as well proven and not nearly as well tested, and not there's dozens of different diets that people recommend on the basis of nutrition science. So it's only been around for less than 50 years or something, as opposed to physics, which has been around for hundreds of years and has this long historical tradition. So fields can have better or worse track records. You have to consider that when you're thinking about what is this person claiming to be an expert in. But also, very importantly, fields can be more or less ideologically biased. There's no such thing as a philosophically neutral science. There's no such thing as value-free science. Everyone engages in interpretation when they are looking at the facts, and there are better and worse standards of interpretation. And then especially when you try to apply that knowledge to real-life practical questions. Like physics, I think, has fewer ideological biases than something like climate science or people who practice climate science, where there are all kinds of questions about the value of certain kinds of industry and certain kinds of economy and the role of government that can be smuggled into their interpretation of the climate science. And people go into the field in the first place, sometimes because they have a certain kind of value orientation or policy agenda that they want to help promote. I would say, all things being equal, if you can reduce your knowledge of the reliability of a field to things that you know well that point you in the direction of, there's a lot of people who know what they're talking about in that field, and then a majority of people in that field agree on some conclusion which you're maybe not in a position to assess yourself because you're not an expert, that can lend some credence to the conclusion, all things being equal. And in just the same way as, like, if you're getting eyewitnesses to a crime and all of the eyewitness testifiers agree on what they witnessed, that's a form of corroboration. Of course, it's a form of corroboration that works only if you have good reason to think that they are testifying to this fact independently, that they all reached it using the same methods of observation, et cetera, that they haven't been influenced by some third party, or that they haven't, collaborated together with each other. And so, if that were the reason why lots of the scientists agreed, that they independently came to this conclusion, that would be a form of corroboration that would integrate your knowledge even further. It's an all things being equal consideration that you might regard agreement as in, somewhat increasing the degree of assurance you take in a claim, but it's certainly not definitive, and it's rare that all things are being equal, that all things actually are equal. The essential isn't the number of the people in the field, it's, do you think that they have reason to know what they're talking about? And we'll talk more about that, I think, after we listen to the next video, which has to do with the way that Murray himself evaluates whether or not somebody gets to count themselves as an expert. And this is one of this, I think it's interesting. This is the standard he goes for in this conversation with Rogan and Smith. And so let's watch this video now.
No, there was not starvation in Gaza after 2005. No, there was no deficit of goods coming in. I've been plenty of times.
There was no deficit?
No, there are
no
plenty
goods were kept out.
There are plenty. How many? Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been?
Well, am I not allowed to talk about it now? I've never been to. Have you ever been to Nazi Germany? Are you allowed to have feelings about them?
You can't time travel, but you can.
Right.
But you can travel.
Okay, but so what? So what's the point? Like,
No,
okay.
I find that
Lots of people have been there and agree with me, and lots of people have been there and agree with you.
Yeah, but
so
if
I don't
you're
know
going to
what
spend a year and a half talking about a place, you should at least do the courtesy of visiting it.
All right. I just think this is a non-argument.
You don't think?
Okay. No, I think it's a non-argument.
But if you're an expert,
Well, you have to go and touch the ground. To
no,
be
I
able
think
talk
you have
about
to
it?
see. I think it's a good idea to see stuff, particularly if you
okay.
spend a career talking about something. Yes, I have a journalistic rule of trying never to talk about a country even in passing unless I've at least been there.
Okay.
It's a
But that's
sort of
not
normal. It's a normal thing to do. You're talking about. Hang on. You're talking about crossing points. And not only have you never been to a crossing point in either Egypt or in Israel, but you've never even been to the region.
So you're not
That's
allowed to
amazing
speak
to
about
me.
things that you've read about. You can only speak about things that you've seen with your own eyes.
You can talk about what you want,
Uh-huh.
as you're proving. But that is a different matter from spending an awfully long amount of time talking about an issue in a region you haven't even had the courtesy to visit, whilst developing all of these views about it.
So I should say this is another example of that equivocation at work I mentioned before of, I can't even talk about, I'm not allowed to talk about this if I haven't been there, which is not really what he's saying, but they exploit that. Nevertheless, Tristan, what do you think about this? You have to be there to talk validly about it idea.
Yeah, so, I don't want to straw man Murray either and suggest that he's clearly saying that you have to have been there to comment on an issue significantly, but he is implying that. And he's implying that, you can't, you shouldn't, if you're doing your due diligence, talk about an issue as much as Dave Smith has, if you haven't actually visited the place that's where the issue is taking place, in this case, the Israel-Gaza conflict. And this is really unfortunate because, and I think it's worth noting that Harris takes Murray to task on this, which we'll look at that clip in a moment. But this sort of sets up Murray to be strawmanned, I think, by his opponents, and in this case by Rogan and Smith, who say, rightly, you don't have to go to Nazi Germany to have a view on that. So how can it possibly be a rational standard to say that to have a justified and sort of cohesive view of the Israel-Gaza conflict, you need to have been to the region? And I think it's true that you don't need to have been there. It does undercut the whole idea of testimonial knowledge in a way, because if you were there, then you don't need someone else's testimony about what that place is like. You could just, the extreme version of that argument, obviously, is you could just say, well, you should just go look at everything firsthand and then form a firsthand opinion. But then if that's what you're doing, that suggests that there's no division of labor of there were some people who already went there and you can trust their testimony about it. Given all of that, though, or notwithstanding all of that, I do think that there is something that Murray should have said and probably wanted to say, which is that people have basic assumptions that are not warranted and would dissipate if you studied an issue carefully, in this case, the Israel-Gaza conflict, that can make it easier to believe falsehoods. So in this case, their disagreement is really focused here on, okay, like what's the nature of the crossing points and what kind of goods are being allowed in or not. And they also talk about Dave Smith's idea that Israel is an apartheid state and that the situation of Gaza is akin to a concentration camp. And I think what Murray is reacting to rightfully is that people have all of these assumptions about the nature of Israel as an evil, colonial state that characterizes or that colors the kinds of assumptions that they're going to make and the kind of falsehoods that they will accept about the conflict. And that, if you actually were to properly study it, it would be, you could eliminate some of those bad assumptions or at least revise some of those bad assumptions. And there's obviously no guarantee that you would do that. But I think that's kind of what Murray is picking up on, is that people have a caricature view of the conflict based on bad assumptions or unwarranted assumptions that they bring into it.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, Tristan, when you say that the argumentative dodge that Murray is relying on here, and I think really that's all it is a kind of dodge, undercuts his whole position by undercutting the very idea of reliable testimony. Because if you want other people to listen to your expertise, and if you want them to do so rationally, if you want to be able to write about what you yourself, let's say as a journalist, observe in Gaza or wherever you go, well, then you need to think that they can listen to you rationally based on whatever expertise that you have, without having to go there to check for themselves whether what you said happened really happened. So, yeah, it's a unfortunately self-destructive kind of argument, and one that misses the forest for the trees. Like the reason why we need experts isn't that there's no time travel. It's that we can't know everything for ourselves, as I mentioned before, that there's too much to know. We don't have not just the technology, we might not have the time, we might not have the interest to go and investigate everything for ourselves. We don't have the cognitive capacity to learn it all. And therefore, we need to farm that out to people who do, and who do have the interests. It's that we can't do all of the work that it takes to know anything, if only because we can't afford the savvy world travel that some people are able to afford. And one thing that I think follows from this point, that you don't actually need to be there to know everything for yourself to be able to comment on it, is that it doesn't follow from this that you don't need experts. That just because you can read about something in a distant land and come to form a view on it, what follows from that is that you have to have some standards when you evaluate the different sources that you consult. You have to be able to assess journalists for the reliability of their reporting and look at their track record and how often is it that what they report turns out not to be the case. And some of them have higher credibility than others. And something else you mentioned about the philosophical assumptions is also really important, that journalists, obviously, everybody knows, can be biased. And so you have to constantly assess for their bias. And often what that means is learning how to separate their reporting of basic observable facts that anybody who's on the ground should be in a position to observe from their own interpretation of those facts, their interpretation of the significance of the facts, of what caused the facts, about what the consequences of those facts will be, about what's the right policy for dealing with those facts. So just as an example of this dispute originally had to do with crossings into Gaza, with the question of whether or not Gazans were starving in 2005. And Murray says, Smith, you weren't there to see whether food was going across, etc. And one of the assumptions that I think both of them share in this dispute is, well, if it turns out that for whatever reason Israel isn't giving food to the Gazans, well, then that must by itself mean that Israel is a cruel, tyrannical occupier committing apartheid, genocide, etc. And you could, because I'm sure it's true that there have been times in the last few years where there's been the war in Gaza that in fact the Israelis have been cutting off food to Hamas, cutting off food to Gaza because of the aggression of Hamas. And so it may well be true that there are cases where that food is being cut off. And the question is, what are you to make of that? I mean, that is now a separate policy, moral, philosophical, political question, where you have to decide on what are your standards for when a government has the right to cut off food, say, for example, because it's in fighting a war of self-defense against an aggressive party. And yeah, there are going to be innocent civilians who might be in the crossfire of that or otherwise harmed, but that's the responsibility of the aggressive party and not the nation that's fighting the war of self-defense. And so those are the kinds of philosophical assumptions you have to learn to unearth from this discourse and separate from the more basic factual questions. And I mean, just my overall view about how to assess the media is that the so-called mainstream media, like the legacy corporate media, the major news networks, the major newspapers, etc., generally speaking, and this is not 100% true, but generally they are better at verifying and corroborating really basic observable facts about who crossed a border at what time or whatever during a certain crisis. They're better at reporting those kinds of facts. Doesn't mean they always get it right. Doesn't mean bias doesn't sometimes infect their interpretation of the facts. They're not very good at unearthing their bias. They all have biases. One side has right-wing bias, another side has left-wing bias. Okay, so I think this is going to be one of the last videos we look at. This is where you mentioned Tristan Harris pushes back a bit on Murray's standard here of assessing expertise. Let's see how he does that and how then Murray tries to defend himself.
You need not, in order to judge the ethics of a war, right, provided you are actually in touch with the facts about it and you're reading good sources and you know what is actually happening, you can judge the ethics and you can know who's on the moral high ground without ever having been to either of the respective countries, right? Like you can you could obviously judge. We could be talking about a war that happened 100 years ago, and be scholars of that conflict. And the burden is not upon either of us to have been to the region.
The reason why it matters in the now is that if you were litigating a foreign conflict or a domestic conflict that happened 100 years ago, much, if not all, of the dust would have settled.
Mm.
You'd be able to get a rounded view of what was happening, what had gone on, and be able to reflect on it. When it's something that is happening now, the dust is not settled by any means, literal or metaphorical, and the consensus view has not emerged. And much if not most, of the reporting and what that comes out of the region is wildly off. So I don't think it is possible, actually, to simply rely on some published sources. No, I don't think that at all. And I think it is the duty of somebody commenting on such a thing to go and see it firsthand.
So Murray makes a really good point here that I think is worth bringing up, that it's very specifically about ongoing issues, and all the more so about conflicts where it's difficult for journalists to have access at all. It's very difficult to understand what's happening in the moment. So a great example of this is the Russia-Ukraine war, where we don't really have any certainty. I don't think anyone has any real certainty about the actual military and civilian casualties in that conflict. It's very difficult to have journalistic access to it. Both governments are motivated to not reveal that information, and or exaggerate that information, whether it's losses or civilian deaths or losses for the other side and so on. But as we've kind of discussed just before, I think what Harris says is absolutely right. And taking Murray directly to this point, that it's obvious that you don't need to have been somewhere to be able to comment on it. But just to focus on the war in Russia and Ukraine for a moment, I mean, that conflict has been going on since 2014. And if we think about the broader context of the history of the Soviet Union, there's a lot of history there that's really well understood. And so, making claims about it, there's a lot of history that you can access. There's a lot of really well-established knowledge. So it's not as though, and same with the Israel, Arab-Israeli conflict. So I don't think Murray's sort of defense of that, oh, you still need to go look at it yourself because the dust hasn't settled, doesn't really quite work, even though I think in a very limited sense, he's right that in very new ongoing conflicts, there's certain things that you can't clearly know because people don't have access to it.
Yeah, I think the left in this dispute also is the assumption that what makes it difficult to be able to comment on something like a war is uncertainty about the particular concrete journalistic facts of the day in relation to that war. And I think as you were suggesting, Tristan, that's just not usually what is the cause of disagreement. It's not usually the disagreement about how many people were killed that day, or even necessarily who started it in a particular iteration of fighting. It's a broader moral philosophical question about what justifies a war. It's a question about, for example, the nature of the two countries that are fighting each other, and what is their basic form of government, and what are their basic goals as governments, and what are they trying to bring to the people that they are defending and or conquering. That is very much part of the way I think that we at the Ayn Rand Institute think about the conflict in Israel, that it's sort of irrelevant who started the latest iteration, because what you have between Israel and Gaza is a conflict between a basically free Western nation, Israel, and a basically unfree authoritarian religious theocratic dictatorship, which is the Hamas administration of Gaza. And that plays heavily into how it's not that everything that Israel can do is right, but that weighs heavily in favor of understanding what they're doing is a kind of act of self-defense that's justifiable against that kind of characteristically unjust oppressor. And I think what that points to is, if there's a particular kind of expertise that's being ignored, usually in these kinds of disputes, it's not the expertise of the on-the-ground reporter. They get their say. They usually get well publicized. It's the expertise that is involved in philosophy that almost nobody ever bothers to exercise. Most people don't think that there can be such a thing as expertise in philosophy. That is, they don't think there's a way to, let's say, scientifically, rationally demonstrate the value assumptions that you are bringing to bear in some kind of controversy, like about whether or not it is better for a country to protect individual rights rather than to impose a theocracy. That's a philosophical assumption. They think, well, that's just a starting point. We all assume. Maybe some of us feel good about it. Maybe our religion tells us that it's right or wrong. But nobody ever bothers to think, are these assumptions that could actually be rationally justified? And so if there's a missing expert in this kind of controversy, it's very often the philosopher. And people think that philosophy isn't needed because they listen to a series of pseudo-experts who say that it isn't, who say that it's all subjective, who say that they should just take it on faith.
So let's move to, so we talked a lot about like history and expertise in history, but there's also a distrust of expertise in science. So maybe we can turn to that.
Yeah, and this is why this helps answer in part, why do people not invest the experts with the kind of rational trust that they sometimes ought to? And this is something that very interestingly came up in the conversation between Harris and Murray. So here goes.
One of the things that COVID did was it stripped us of the consensus that the scientists were the last sort of cathedral of knowledge that you really did listen to.
Yeah.
And I said long time ago about this, that, you know, once trust the science wasn't respected anymore for some good reasons, we were completely stripped of anything in our society that we could trust.
Yeah, and I think Murray is picking up on something important here, that the crisis in expertise, as we've called it, doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not coming out of a vacuum. There are reasons and events that cause the distrust of expertise to spike and increase, or at least have more significant platforms. And I think certainly in the case of COVID, there was, and I think with some justification, some skepticism of policy, of skepticism about, okay, is it actually wise? Does it actually make sense? Is it actually a justified trade-off to completely shut down our entire economy? Is it true that even if that is effective, that is like a worthwhile trade-off that we should be making? But I think in that case, a lot of that got grouped together in an unjustified way with skepticism, particularly of scientific findings and of the medical community at large, particularly the pharmaceutical aspect of that, but even just the medical industry as a whole. And people often during COVID, and I think since, have like run those two together. But it makes sense, and I think there's some justification for the idea that when policies like that are implemented by force and you can't question them, right? It's just a government decision that's being made, and it's not like super clear how it's, certainly the way it was explained, it's not super clear how it's related to a justified or clear, proper role of government, that people then have skepticism about it. And then, but the problem is that people then associate that with scientific findings as well. And I think it's not a coincidence that there was so much vaccine skepticism about the efficiency of it, skepticism about the motivations of the pharmaceutical companies that were developing them, and so on. And I think it is important to note that it's true that sometimes there can be systemic bias in a field. So we're not saying, I think you would agree, Ben, that we're not saying that can't happen. So sometimes a whole field can be biased, especially by something that's not directly related to their field. For example, a philosophical perspective. And I think a great example of that is how in the work of Alex Epstein, for example, in his work Fossil Future, he talks about how there's a systemic bias that people have against fossil fuels because people only focus on the negative aspects of them, on the cost of them to the environment, to the prevalence of CO2 in the atmosphere and so on. And they don't think about how do you weigh that against the value perspective of the positives that fossil fuels bring to civilization. And when you have systemic bias like that, that's built into a field, it's true that then you would evaluate that field differently and you would evaluate the experts in that field differently.
Yes. And I think it's really important that trust is something that has to be earned. So even when you have the, let's say, scientific chops to figure out the cause of certain disease, what's the necessary treatment for them, what are ways to stop the spread of disease, it's still an extra thing to communicate to your customers, to the public, et cetera, that you have that knowledge and that you should be trusted to be able to recommend certain kinds of things. And here, if you look at, for example, the history of what happened 5 years ago during the COVID pandemic, there were definitely things that certain scientists did, not all, certain scientists did that in spite of whatever qualifications and knowledge they had, they did things to lose the trust of the public. And like the best example of this that I can give is that prior to 2020, prior to COVID, there had been major studies by World Health Organization, by the CDC, Johns Hopkins, any number of major reputable public health authorities that looked extensively at the collection of evidence and concluded that it would be a bad idea to use what they called non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is to say things like extensive quarantine or business closures, aka lockdowns, in order to try to combat, especially if what you're talking about is an airborne respiratory disease. Like there was just very little evidential basis to think that it could be contained, because, especially if we're talking about airborne, respiratory disease. And so what happened in COVID was there were a few people early on who said, hey guys, remember this research we just did? And in fact, one of the major studies had been concluded in 2019. Remember this research we just did? It says we shouldn't be doing the thing that China is doing. And a few of them spoke up, but very quickly there was panic, there was fear, there was guilt, there was evidence from what was happening in China, and it sort of looked like maybe the Chinese containment strategy was working. Of course, China is an authoritarian society, and so for reasons we talked about previously, there would be good reasons not to trust reports coming out of the authoritarian regime where the disease originates. But for one reason or another, fear, guilt, panic, undue credulity in China, all of that research was thrown out the window. And so that's the kind of thing that will lead people to distrust scientists when the scientists change their own tune, and not because of new evidence emerging, but because of political pressures. And why did they do this? Why were they subject to this pressure? Well, in part, I think it goes back to some of the things we've already talked about. In part, it goes back to the fact that there are different kinds of expertise on different subject matters. The fact that you're an expert, let's say, on epidemiology doesn't make you an expert on policy. And so if you are then advocating lockdowns because of something that you know about the virus, that is not necessarily justified. And in fact, it's also an example of how people's basic moral, political, philosophical assumptions end up leading them not just to interpret the data they have in a way that is not necessarily justified, but even to abandon the data that they have on the assumption, well, if we accept this data, people are going to call us mean-spirited. They're going to say that we want to have human sacrifice. They're going to say that we're not doing enough to protect the vulnerable, etc. And therefore, they feel guilted into ignoring their own evidence. And so, like, these are the kinds of things where you need to know very clearly what is the actual evidence, what is the actual science, what does it allow you, logically speaking, to comment on, what areas of discourse are not relevant. Like having medical knowledge doesn't give you economic, political, or philosophical knowledge. And these are things that all are unattended to. These are things that people do not pay enough attention to. They don't think about what are the philosophic justifications. And again, it's like further evidence, I think, that if there's a problem here, it's with not investing enough in the idea that there is such a thing as philosophical expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we're talking about the causes of erosion of trust and expertise, I think it's also important to explain some of the philosophical causes of that as well. So from the other side of it. So, and I think one reason is not so much a reaction to policy, I think, but a sort of a rational conception of like what it means to think independently. And that I think people often bring this kind of conception of independence to thinking about certain issues such as COVID or medical science, as it regards vaccines in particular, but also about history. And there's this idea that I think Joe Rogan's podcast sometimes suggests that what you need in order to come up with a justified view of something is you just do a bit of your own homework. You just read a little bit about different views, and then you just come to your own opinion, your own independent conclusion. And that if you just, the flip side of that is that if you take experts at their word, or if you rely mainly on what's conventionally agreed upon by experts, that by itself means that you're not being independent. And I think this kind of comes up in two specific forms, I think. So one is, and I think Joe Rogan is a great example of this first one that's problematic, is one is there is this kind of egalitarianism that, well, the reason you can't rely on experts is because everyone's kind of on the same footing. And really, you can be objective by just showcasing people with different kinds of views, right? So Joe will have people on who are like actual historians, but then he'll have people on who are not qualified to be historians, or who present views for which there's very scant evidence. So I talked about, the idea that Churchill was the primary antagonist of World War II and really is responsible for starting that conflict, for example. And again, it's a philosophical issue of the idea that if you just trust experts, or you trust one set of experts, that means that you're being dogmatic and that you're not being independent, and you have to yourself like just choose a variety of sources, or choose your own sources that aren't the mainstream sources, and that you're somehow then like independent of relying on expertise. And then the second, I think, that's worth bringing up is contrarianism. So, and I think this certainly, so the case of World War II is a big one. I think the case of the Ukraine Russia war is another big one. I think there's this satisfaction that people get, especially on the right, of being able to say, well, you thought Churchill was a hero, like like everyone just assumes that. Well, I'm going to show you, like, he actually wasn't. Like, he wasn't that much worse than Hitler, or he's not nearly as good as you think he was. And there's a kind of satisfaction or a trolling element of that, I think, that people want to express a view that's unpopular because it's unpopular and because it's unconventional, and it will get people riled up. And I think there's an aspect of that also with the Ukraine-Russia war, where people really, what's motivating them is they want to point out that they think people have an unduly rosy view of American foreign policy, and they think, oh, like America, has been a kind of angel in. Or they think that people think that America has been an angel in foreign policy, and they're always the good guys, and they're out to spread democracy. But well, if you actually look at it, they're responsible for all these horrible things, such as funding the Taliban and so on. And I think with that, there's a satisfaction that those people get, and I've seen a lot of examples of this, where of saying, oh, Putin's not as bad as you think. Everyone assumes that he's the aggressor, but if we were in that situation, and one of our enemies was joining an alliance against us, we would react the same way. And I think there's a desire to be contrarian in that way and kind of flip the script on how people normally think about things. I think those two things are important philosophical causes as well of like why people distrust experts.
The way that I would sum this up is that independent thinking is definitely a value. As we've talked about today, there are ways to evaluate experts as an independent thinker, using your own independent evidence of whether or not they have the expertise or other specialized knowledge they claim to have, of independently evaluating whether they know what they're talking about based on the evidence you yourself are able to gather. And the reason that that's worth defending, the reason independent thinking is worth defending, is because such things as rationality and truth are central values that actually do matter. But that then means that you don't get to think of yourself or celebrate your independent thinking. You don't get to celebrate or defend yourself as an independent thinker if what you in fact do when you oppose the enemy is just embrace a bunch of arbitrary, fanciful quackery, because that is not consistent with the value of rationality and truth. And so, like, there really is a kind of crisis of expertise. But what I would say more precisely is that it's a crisis of values. It's a crisis of rationality. That in the West, we've lost sight of those values of rationality and truth that made the West great at one point in time. And the alleged defenders of the West approach it simply on the basis of tribal loyalty to tradition, and not to any well-defined rational values. That's where the real philosophical crisis is.
So let's wrap up here. And there's a lot more to think about, especially from the positive perspective that I think we didn't get to. We focused more on the negative aspects of like how people fail to regard expertise properly. But we did talk a bit about it, but there are some great resources for that. One of them from yourself, Ben, where you've talked about being objective about the news. So that's a really useful resource for thinking about how to be an objective consumer of media. And then Greg Salmieri, who's a professor of philosophy, has given a lecture on how to be an objective consumer of science. And we would highly recommend both of those resources in terms of thinking about how you engage with experts in a rational way, in an independent way. So thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, comment, or share on YouTube and Facebook. Please send comments or questions if you have them to newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your comments and questions, and we reply to many of them. Thank you again.